Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ezekiel chapter 1. All right, we started our study our last study involved the introduction to the book of Ezekiel, and I think I told you there that Ezekiel was captured by Babylon, or it was deported from Jerusalem to Babylon, where he spent his entire ministry, prophetic ministry, where this book of Ezekiel was written. He was entirely in captivity the whole time. Now I hope, and as we studied or went through the introduction last week, I mentioned that two videos, and I gave the link to each of them in the comment section of that video. I hope you had time to go through those. That animated video of Ezekiel chapter 1 was the one I wanted you to watch before we studied today's lesson. So I hope you got a chance to do that. If you didn't, it's your life won't come to an end or anything like that. But I just hope that you got to it. It kind of sets you up for the study, the study of the words, the written word of that vision. Okay, well, let's go ahead and start, and we'll see how far we get. I'm planning on going through chapter 1 today. All right, chapter 1, verse 1. In the 13th year, in the 4th month of the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. The 13th year. Right away, we see that where this is measured from, where this 13th year is measured from, is unclear. It says the 13th year of the 4th month of the 5th day. It doesn't say where that 13th year is measured from. Now, as we go through this study, we're going to see that many, many times Ezekiel gives dates similar to that one, but he gives an anchor point where you can measure from to know when the thing actually happened that he's talking about. But right away here, we see that we don't know where we're measuring from. Had three commentaries that are primary commentaries for this study. One is the NIV application commentary, one is the New American Commentary, and I think the third one I used was the Broadman commentary. And none of these three commentaries would agree, but for us it is not really important. This is probably around 593 BC. Jerusalem has not yet been destroyed. That's what's going to happen in this study. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. We're going to get many prophecies of restoration. It's a very upsetting book to read about what happens to Judah, what caused it, but it's also very uplifting to see the prophecies of restoration that apply for them and for us as well. We'll see as we get to that. He says he is already in exile. He was one of the earliest to go. I believe I told you he was in the second wave of exiles that were taken out of Jerusalem. And here he's on the Kibar River, which it's in Babylon, and that was a man-made canal used for irrigation. So it's just something to know. I might tell you that he was one of the earliest, possibly he was in the same time as Daniel and his friends during the exile. Ezekiel refers to himself here as being among the exiles. I think my note here means that he said this something like 116 times in this book. So that's something he wanted you to know. It shows that he views himself in a unique position to announce the future restoration and other prophecies directed to the captives, because he's one of them. He's not off over here preaching to a group over here. He's here in the midst of all these people that he's preaching to. It applies to him as well as to them. He announces here that something very dramatic is about to happen. The heavens were opened and he saw visions of God. Okay, if you were to see visions of God, you'd think that's pretty dramatic. You know, he's got it in his mind now that something big is getting ready to happen. Okay, so let's look at verses 2 and 3. Let me read those. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kibar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. He's the son of Buzi. He's a priest. He records here that a very important condition is that the hand of the Lord was on him. He's not just making this up. I think I'll just go out and tell the people this. He said, no, God is with me. He's the one giving me these words. At this point, Ezekiel is a priest, but not yet a prophet. That's an interesting distinction. He was a priest. He had priestly duties in Jerusalem, but they were not to be a prophet. He has not had that title bestowed on him yet, but that is what is happening here. The first 3 chapters are about, the first chapter is about the vision of God coming for Ezekiel. That's what we're studying right now, where God is coming for him. And in chapter 2 and chapter 3, he's going to get the instructions for his mission. So then after the first 3 chapters are his call, and you're going to be very impressed with what you read there. At this point, I'll say I just said that the visions are about to be described, and they're about his prophetic call. These are divine visions. They're initiated by God and delivered by God. Initiated by God with Ezekiel and delivered to Ezekiel by God. And I want you to be aware that it is very important to believe and accept that Ezekiel is doing this thing that he's talking about in the book of Ezekiel because God initiated it and he told him to do it. He's not just making it up, not something that would be nice to do. It's important to know that the people are not yet crushed. You know, a whole bunch of them have gone into exile, but they're not yet crushed. Jerusalem has not yet fallen. When it finally does fall, in the not too distant future, they will consider themselves crushed. That does not happen until about 587 BC, about 6 years from now. Now, I want to talk about that word crushed for a minute. We studied the book of Jeremiah, and following the book, and he was a prophet about the same time talking about the same thing, but he was not in captivity. After the book of Jeremiah, there's the book of Lamentations. If you want to know what crushed is, read Lamentations. It talks about the conditions in Jerusalem after it was destroyed, about the people that were left there. It's phenomenal. They were crushed. Babylon crushed them. I think it is important from our perspective to understand what exile means. I want you to think about this. I want to read this. It's from the NIV application commentary. It's on by Ian M. Duguid. I want to read this. He's quoting another person here. That's what I'm reading. Her name is Tamara Eskenazi. But this is what exile means. Exile, it is not simply being homeless. Rather, it is knowing that you do have a home, but that your home has been taken over by enemies. Exile It is not being without roots. On the contrary, it is having very deep roots, which have now been plucked up, and there you are with roots dangling, writhing in pain, exposed to a cold and jeering world, longing to be restored to native and nurturing soil. Exile is knowing precisely where you belong, but knowing that you cannot go back, not yet. Very sad time, but they're living under judgment. That's what this is all about. Life cannot be business as usual. Very important scripture in Lamentations. I'd like to read a couple of things to you. Lamentations 2, verse 18. The hearts of the people cry out to the Lord. Your walls of daughter Zion, the hearts of the people cry out to the Lord. Your walls of daughter Zion, let your tears flow like a river day and night. Give yourself no relief, your eyes no rest. It's called being in exile. Chapter 3, Lamentations 3, verses 46 to 51. It's written by Jeremiah. What's he called? The weeping prophet. See if you see that here. 46, chapter 3, verse 46 to 51 in Lamentations. All your enemies have opened their mouths wide against us. We have suffered terror and pitfalls, ruin and destruction. Streams of tears flow from my eyes because my people are destroyed. My eyes will flow unceasingly without relief until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees. Verse 51, what I see brings grief to my soul because of all the women of my city. The women. Why would he be concerned about the women? What happened to the men? There are no men. Many of them, most of them were killed because they fought when they were warned by Jeremiah not to fight. If you don't fight, things will go well for you in Babylon. But they fought to protect their homeland. Okay, then there was Lamentations. Here's the verse, Lamentations 3, verses 22 and 23. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. That is mercy. That is mercy. They know that it is merciful because they were not consumed. Some of them died, but there is a remnant that were saved. And that remnant, they thought the remnant was the ones that lived in Jerusalem. No, the remnant were the ones that were taken from Jerusalem, because the ones that stayed in Jerusalem to fight are the ones that were killed. There was a remnant. God showed his mercy by saving a remnant. Isaiah is the one that developed the doctrine of the remnant and said that there will always be a remnant. All right. Now, as we go through Ezekiel, I want you to think concept. You're going to get this feeling that they're undergoing judgment, and they are undergoing judgment by God, God's judgment. God sent the Babylonians to exact his judgment on them. But I want you to realize that there is a difference in discipline and judgment. Judgment is final, but discipline is meted out by God, hoping that they will come back to him. God told you that their apostasy was such that they did things by rote, and it was very legalistic with no relationship with God. He wants his people to come back to him. So this is considered discipline. There's a remnant. There will always be a people to come back. Okay? I want you to think about the difference in those two things. Jeremiah and Ezekiel will inform the people that all of the coming calamity is consequences of their own sin. God didn't decide to do this for fun. He was very hurt by the way they related to him, and he exacts the consequences of their sin. And he's the righteous judge, so who better to be the one to do it? Right here, I have to talk about this. Judah will go into exile under Babylon for 70 years. They're going to be released, but when they're released from Babylon, they're going to be released by the Medes and the Persians. So they're still going to be living under their rule, but it's going to be a situation where they can stay in Babylon and live there, or they can return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and rebuild the city. Some did, went back, some didn't. Following that, the Greeks conquered the Medes and the Persians, so they're going to live under Greek rule for a while. And then who comes along after the Greeks? The Romans come and conquer the Greeks. So all of that time, they're living under somebody's rule. They're still in exile, so to speak. They don't have their own place, so to speak. The bottom line is that Israel will cease to be a nation until 1948. That's 2,500 years from the dates of these prophecies. They will cease to be a nation. But in God's great love for them, they will not be consumed. I read that in Lamentations 3:22-23. There will always be a remnant, and I mentioned to you that Isaiah was the one that developed the doctrine of the remnant. So from that standpoint, God did show mercy to them as a nation. He showed mercy to them. They will always remain as a national identity, and that is Jew. They will always be Jews, and they will be identifiable. In 722 BC, the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom, and then they were ready to take Jerusalem in the southern kingdom. They had it surrounded, and Hezekiah was king, I believe, and he thought it's all over. But in God's timing, it's not over until God says it's time. They were surrounded with you have to read about it. It was around Isaiah 37, somewhere in that area. It could have been back in the Kings as well, but they were surrounded, and that night, the night before they were to take Jerusalem, the angel of the Lord came in and slayed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. Without firing a shot. They just woke up and everybody was dead. The king left and didn't come back. Very interesting account of God's compassion and his timing. They're not abandoned or forgotten, but they will eventually live with the promise of hope and restoration. We're going to see that. All right, verse 4. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming. And this is the part that video does such a marvelous job of animating. This is where it starts. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. Now, good luck trying to figure out how that looks in your mind. What is it that Ezekiel saw? That's what he wrote down, what he saw. He saw a windstorm from the north, full of lightning, surrounded by brilliant light, looked like glowing metal in the center. The animation showed this very well. We have been told there are visions, these are visions of God. He is not stuck in the temple. God is not stuck in the temple. He is active and he is on the move, as we will see. The storm is immense. He sees it off in the distance. He's got this vision, and this is what he's seeing. This windstorm off in the lightning in it, way off in the distance, and it's immense. It gets closer and closer, and it gets bigger and bigger. Pretty soon, it has engulfed him. He finds himself in the center of it all. And the storm is coming from the north, which is the traditional direction of the invasion, which means Babylon. And it's accounted in Jeremiah 1:14. Let me read that real quick. It's short, 1:14. Let you know everything comes from the north. You see that in Revelation and other places, Daniel. You see it in other places as well. 1:14. The Lord said to me, this is Jeremiah, from the north disaster will be poured on all who live in the land. From the north. And he's talking about Babylon coming from the north. Before going on, we should, I hope, realize the video gives a demonstration that the words of this vision are Ezekiel's description of what he saw. How would you describe a rainbow to a blind person? Well, that's in essence what Ezekiel is doing here. He is just trying to describe something very involved and detailed, and to a people that are just trying to understand what he's writing. He's doing the best he can to write it where we can understand what he saw. It's something awesome, something immense. The video was only intended to give a visual expression of the written words. I want to encourage you again to watch it, even though I wanted you to see it before this lesson. You'll see what I'm talking about after you watch it. All right, verses 5 to 14, it's about four creatures, which are actually cherubim. Ezekiel had been watching the storms come in his vision, from which four living creatures emerged, and they have 10 characteristics. These four creatures have 10 characteristics. Let's start with verse 5. And in the fire was what looked like four living creatures. In appearance, their form was human. The form was human. They looked like a man. Each had four. And I wonder if I was supposed to read all of that. Yeah, I'm going to read 5 through 14, and then we'll look at the 10 characteristics. This is what Ezekiel saw. Starting in verse 5. And in the fire was what looked like four living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had four faces and four wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings of their four sides, they had human hands. It's a lot of detail in here. All four of them had faces and the wings of one touched the wings of another. So they're standing here like this. I'm here. He's got my wing going this way. Got another one over there. His wing is coming and touching me right here. And the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the four had the face of a human being, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox, and also the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out upward, each wing touching that of the creature on the other side, and each had 2 other wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals or a fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. Verse 14, the creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. Wow. Did you get all that? Each of the creatures had appearance like a man. Not like a man. The appearance of a man. Each had 4 faces. A man, which is human, a lion, which is wild, an ox, which is domesticated, and an eagle, which is the most powerful of God's winged creatures. These 4 represent the highest form of life in their category. They had straight legs, that means no joints. They had hoofs, suggesting stability. All this is in there. You have to go back and look at it. Under their wings, they had hands like humans. Verse 8 says their wings touched the creature next to it, like the cherubim in the Holy of Holies, 1 Kings 6:27. The 5th attribute was each went straight when they moved, no turns. That suggests a sense of purpose, commitment, and availability. We're going to see this is God's chariot we're talking about here. The following, they followed the spirit of the movement, in verses 12 and 20. It refers to the divine spirit of the one on the throne who directs their movements. We haven't even talked about the throne yet. The Hebrew word is ruah, meaning spirit. That's the word I think to use. Wind or breath. Wheels can indicate wind, direction, side, agency of conveyance, agency of animation, agency of inspiration, mind, and sign of divine ownership. Remember, here we are talking about God himself, so the list of meanings is endless. He is complex and he is a mystery. We only know about him what he wants us to know. So the cherubim are divinely appointed and empowered to do the will and work of God. That's what these 4 creatures are. They're cherubim and they have a purpose, and the purpose is given by God. Their appearance is like burnished bronze, like coals of fire. This was particularly interesting in the video, the way they appeared. I mean, it's hard to picture in your mind what we're talking about here, but they did a good job in that video. The brightness of their appearance suggests proximity to God. They were close. Remember what happened to Moses when he came close to God, and the way his face radiated, and he had to wear a veil for a while, found in Exodus 34, verses 29 to 35. So they're around him all the time. So that's part of the reason for their brightness, probably, I guess. I'm just speculating. The 9th attribute was movement. It was quick like lightning. Verse 14 suggests instantaneous action in relation to God's will and command. We don't get to this until later, but their wings made an awesome sound like rushing water. We'll see that when we get to verse 24. Remember, these spiritual beings were part human, part angel, and part animal, representations of the whole created order. Their activity affirms the direction God affirms the direction God gives to his created order. Further, remember, these visions are parts of Ezekiel's call vision. So we've got this vision going on, and the purpose of this vision is not to display God's awesome power. It's to call Ezekiel. God is there. Of course, anytime God is involved in anything, it's awesome. But he is there in this vision to call. The purpose of him being there is to call Ezekiel to be a prophet. Okay, verses 15 to 21. Let me read those, 15 to 21. Okay, verse 15 to 21, this is about the wheels. This is very interesting. When I taught this lesson the first time with the ladies in the class, I told the class we're going to study Ezekiel, and she said, "Oh, big wheel, little wheel." This is the prophecy of the big wheel, little wheel that she mentioned, and it made me think to something that was said to me at work one time, a long time ago, back in the 70s probably. Somebody said that, this vision of this big wheel, little wheel was probably a biblical account of an extraterrestrial vehicle, a UFO. I thought, that's crazy. Okay, 15 to 21. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. This is what they looked like. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. You got a wheel like this, and you got a smaller wheel inside like this. One's going this way, one's going this way. That's what I think. That's what the video showed. I couldn't figure out what this was talking about. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. In verse 17, as they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all their rims were full of eyes all around. So you got these wheels, they got eyes all over them they're all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved, and when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. In verse 20, wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. In verse 21, when the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. All right, the wheel on the ground. There's a wheel on the ground beside each creature. Each wheel had another wheel intersecting it. They did not turn. They went when the creatures went. They did not turn means they did not change directions. All right, they have a focused direction. It's very interesting. They were high and awesome and full of eyes. Whenever or wherever the creatures went, the wheels went as well, forward, up, and being still. Why? Because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. God's spirit is their spirit. This is all about the chariot throne of God. That's what we're talking about here. God is coming for Ezekiel. He is coming for him to give him his call. This is his throne. This is his chariot. This is all about the chariot throne of God. The wheels give it mobility. The whole picture is affirming the presence of God. The wheels are the lowest part of the chariot. That makes sense. That's what's on the ground. The wheels are the lowest part of the chariot throne, and they sat on the ground below the cherubim. Remember, each wheel was actually two wheels, one wheel intersecting the other. So like this. This arrangement allows movement of the throne. This arrangement allows movement of the throne platform in any direction. Remember, the wheels rims were high and awesome with eyes. Remember, the vision about God. This vision is about God. All of their imagery suggests the eyes are omniscient, the wheels are omnipresence, and the elevated positions are omnipotence. So that's what we get. Those are three characteristics of God, and that's what the suggestion of this picture is, this vision. All right, 12 to 27 is about the platform. You got the wheels, the cherubim, and the platform. It's actually, the word for it is rakia, which we're going to talk about briefly when we get to it. Let me read verse 22. Spread out above the heads of the living creature was what looked something like a vault, sparkling like crystal and awesome. Wheels, cherubim, platform. It says it looked like a vault. That word vault in the Hebrew is rakia. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because if you've got the ESV or an older version of the NIV, that word is expanse. If you've got the King James or the NASB, that word is firmament. You've heard that word firmament before. It's in the creation account, biblical account of creation. I'm reading from the NIV, so the word is vault. We'll talk about that in a second. So, our commentator, one of my commentators, says that this refers to a platform above the cherubim. The RSV calls it a canopy. Now, if you go to the second day of creation in Genesis, it talks about the separation of the waters. You have this water, and the waters are separated by the rakia. And rakia is a word we don't know the meaning of. That's crazy, isn't it? We don't know the meaning of it. Now, the King James was developed from the Latin Vulgate. I think 1611 was when something like that, when the King James was developed. It was developed from the Latin Vulgate, which was developed from the Hebrew, and the Hebrew had the word rakia. They didn't know what rakia meant, so they made up a word called firmamentum in the Latin. And that suggests something firm. We're talking about the rakia that separates the waters from the water. It's called sky in places, but that's not a word that they can prove. but the word they used was firmamentum, which indicates it was something firm that separated those waters from the waters. Uh, then science comes along and says it can't be that. The guy that has the Creation Museum down in Glen Rose, Texas, uh, believes in canopy theory, which there was a canopy which existed, which separated the waters. And then when we had the flood, then those waters dumped, and so on and so forth. Uh, Everything I read indicates that it's something more like a vault or something, some kind of barrier. So there's some kind of something here that we're calling a platform. It's called, they're assuming it's a platform because God's throne sits on top of it. We're going to see as we go further. Now, I've written a book called What God Did. I've devoted 2 chapters to this word rakia. It's too much to talk about here, but that's the reason for the difference in your version saying vault and some saying firmament and some saying what I was going to say, the King James just carried the Latin firmamentum into there because they didn't know what else to use. They just called it firmament. So that's what that is. But that's the reason your translation has something different. It's for whatever reason, translators chose to just choose a different word, a meaning for that word. It doesn't really matter necessarily. God's not going to judge us based on it if we don't have any way to know what it actually means. But they're calling it here some kind of platform because God's throne is sitting on top of it. All right. So we'll just go on from there. It's probably very confusing to you because we're talking about a word that nobody knows the exact meaning of. I believe vault is the correct word, and I developed the meaning for that in that book, What God Did. Nevertheless, it looks like ice, meaning the expanse was something on top of the vault, probably was a vast open area with an area that looks like ice. See what I've not told you. Oh yeah, I'll just tell you this and then we'll move on. Martin Luther thought that the sky was solid and that God actually, based on scripture, God actually pinned the stars up there where they are. Well, we know it's not solid. It'd be tough to fly an airplane into a solid sky, but you have to also keep in mind that all of that business that we're talking about in Genesis 1 happened when nobody was around. And it was a different time. It was developed out of nothing, and God developed it because that's what it needed to be for creation. So who knows what it actually was? We have the Bible to tell us as best as we can to understand it. But nevertheless, they chose the same word here, rakia, to talk about that area right above the cherubim where on top of which God's throne sits. Okay. Hope I didn't confuse you or digress too much, but I didn't really think it was a digression because it's one of 2 places where that word occurs. It occurs here and it occurs several times in Genesis 1. Beyond that, it's not in the Bible anywhere else. Okay, verse 23 and 23, 24, and 25. Let me read those. Under the vault, their wings stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering their body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of the wings like the roar of rushing waters. Here's 3 sounds, like the roar of when they moved their wings. They heard the sound of like rushing water, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. The cherubim stretched out two wings toward one another. They covered their body with the other two wings. So two go this way and two go this way. I already mentioned about the sound of the rushing waters. They had the three different sounds. But the water, when the creatures moved, was like the voice of the Almighty. It was like the voice of a mighty army, and it was like an army, or it was like the voice of the Almighty. After the wings made a sound like the voice of the Almighty, then he actually speaks. All right. Verse 25 says, "Then there came a voice from above the vault over their heads as they stood with lowered wings." Before we go any further, these creatures are cherubim. I want you to realize something. These creatures are cherubim from being God's, aside from being God's throne bearers, they are guardians of God's holiness. They are his heavenly bodyguards. I mean, God doesn't need protection, but it's part of his entourage, and they're his bodyguards. They are not fat, little, roly-poly babies with wings. These are sword-wielding enforcers of divine judgment. When you think about cherubim, you got this mental picture. Unless you've studied a lot of Bible, you got TV and you got books and cartoons and everything else with pictures of cherubim, and they're these fat little roly-poly little angel-looking things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about fierce warriors. When Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, God put cherubim and a flaming sword to protect the way to the tree of life. He didn't choose some namby-pamby little thing to do that job. He put cherubim there. That's what we're talking about here. 4 cherubim. They're powerful creatures. Okay, and in verse 26 and 27, let me read that. Above the vault, over their heads, was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli. That's what this has. I have no idea what that is. And high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. On the throne, a figure looked like that of a man. This does not mean God looks like a man, for God has no appearance. We might call this a theophany. It's the best we can do. It's a visible manifestation of God. This is the way he chose to look in this vision. Okay? Might seem somewhere else he's going to look a different way. If he's going to appear to you, this is the way let's just leave it at that. This is the way he appeared to Ezekiel in this vision. And it's a vision. This is his appearance. His appearance is striking. He is a God of splendor and great power. And it's important to note that thoughts such as this about God had dwindled prior to Jerusalem. Their apostasy ran deep. By that, I mean, I told you the apostasy of the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom was bad. They were conquered by the Assyrians and assimilated into the nations. They ceased to understand and to worship the living God, Yahweh. Same thing had become apparent in the lives of the southern kingdom in Jerusalem, Judah, in Jerusalem. They were hung up on this thing of the law. We're keeping the law. I doubt very seriously if they were doing that, but they got the rituals to follow, and they've got sacrifices to be made, and that's what we've done. That's all God requires. God wants their hearts. They didn't get that. This vision of God in his holiness and all of the attributes that we've talked about here, the run-of-the-mill Israelite or Jew had lost sight of that kind of God. I want you to understand that. This was, aside from it just being very special just because of what it is, the average Jew on the street could not possibly understand this. They didn't like Ezekiel. They don't like his message. They hate the man. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. He is not bound to the land. God is not bound to the land of Israel. What the little book I wrote, What God Did, talks about some gods were regional. When we studied Exodus, we talked about some of the Egyptian gods were regional. They had their powers extended up to the property line, up to the state line, so to speak, or the county line, and they could go no further. Our God, this God, the living God, Yahweh, is not bound by anything. It's something that the Jews had lost sight of. He can go anywhere. He is not stuck in the temple. He can go anywhere. And here he is. Actually, he's not in the temple. He's not even in Israel. He's in Babylon. That's where that's where Ezekiel is. He's in captivity on the Kibar River. And that's where this vision is delivered to Ezekiel. Nearly through. Ezekiel is not looking at God, but a physical manifestation of his presence. As terrifying as I am sure the vision was, it served to remind them of God's holiness and power, and that they were not forgotten. Verse 28a says this, first part of verse 28. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. While the emphasis of Ezekiel 1 is almost exclusively on the gathering clouds of rain, the appearance of the rainbow allows the possibility of a ray of hope even in the midst of gloom. What the rainbow asserts is the faithfulness of God even in the midst of overwhelming judgment. It is that's what's happening. When you see the level of judgment that is coming on Israel, it is going to be overwhelming for you. This is a sign of God's self-commitment to his promise. His judgment will fall on his rebellious people, yet because of his commitment to his covenant, he will not wipe them out. They will not be consumed, as we saw in Lamentations 3:22-23. There will always be a remnant. In Ezekiel, we will see an angry God, but he is so much more than that. No matter how black the gathering storm clouds may be, those who trust in the Lord will live in the light of his covenant faithfulness. This is the end of the first part of the vision. He calls it the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God. Let's look at verse 28b. the last part of verse 28. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Starting in 22, we're going to hear what that voice said. I want to point out to you, he said, the glory of the Lord. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. I want you to look at that word Lord. It's spelled in all caps. We're talking about the word that is used for God, that is that used for Yahweh, which is what is used when the context of what is being said about the Lord is he is looking for relationship with his people. He has lost relationship with his people. And his glory that is showing up here is the glory of the Lord. And it's the glory of God when he is looking for relationship with people, which means in the context of discipline that we talked about before, it's a context of drawing them. What's getting ready to happen is happening in the context of, aside from being, it's more than just punishment for their apostasy. It's discipline in the context of wanting them to come back to him. And that's why the word Lord is spelled the way it is. Okay, that's all I have for you today. We'll start in our next study with chapter 2. I want to thank you for studying with me today.